Okay, so this is my presentation on the environmental justice, indigenous knowledge systems, and Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. It's just a brief paper that looks at the impact of imperialism and colonialism on the environmental justice programs in these regions. And so just a brief, next slide, please. So this is a map of Pacific Islands and what is considered to be in that region. Fun fact, I did not know all the places that were considered to be in the Pacific Islands until very recently, so I learned something new. Next slide. So just a background on this paper. So climate change is progressing and we all can see its effects, but in smaller islands and countries, the effects are extremely exacerbated and they are seeing it first. And all of this has to do, or it has very deep ties and roots to the imperialism and capitalism in those countries that have been driven by white supremacy. And so this paper just looks at how different Pacific Islander groups and communities have tried to reverse this imperialism and capitalism and fight back against it, and how they, and all the different perspectives that they took to approach this injustice. And so this paper just looks at how to apply these different frameworks from their perspectives and look at how to center the culture to broaden the conversation on environmental justice. Next slide. So imperialism and settler colonialism in the Pacific. So the native population were seen as savage, which was a narrative that was created by these white colonizers. And that's the narrative that they use to kind of make the excuse that they need to be civilized. And so this colonialism led to several injustices, the environmental ones being commodification and destruction of land. And so commodification just turned aspects of the environment, so like plants, animals that were eaten for sustenance, into goods that mainly profited the colonial powers while depriving the indigenous communities access to their own resources in healthy environments. And so, and destruction of land on top of that is just how they used lands for their own benefits, such as farming or kind of growing crops that brought these colonizers profit and benefit. And these communities were often ignored by institutions and policymakers, and so they were forced to navigate all of these environmental hazards, from water pollution to waste sites, all on their own. And so this can be seen in Guam, for example, which is a military base, a US military base, and a colonel who kind of talked about how the US sees Guam not as an equal partner, but as a possession. And so all these Pacific Islands and all these islands impacted by colonialism and imperialism were seen as insignificant and just as a possession. And so when the US was thinking about militarizing Guam, a report came out that talked about how this move would destroy jungles to accommodate the population growth. And in doing so, they would have to dredge a lot of coral reefs and impact the biodiversity and the marine life there. And they kind of talked about how the different ways the land would have to be altered and polluted and exploited for military interests, and they went ahead with it. And so right now the country is presented with a lot of irreversible impacts that they're still dealing with to this day. So militarization of the Pacific. So there are currently 375,000 US military and civilian personnel present in these islands. And in terms of pollution and environmental degradation, the military comes first, and they're also a primary source of genocide in these indigenous communities. And all of this is done to defend economic settler colonial interests. So, yep. And next slide. And so this imperialism and colonization, it the relationships that these Indigenous populations and communities had with their environment. And so in doing so, so looking at Micronesia, the mineral extraction there, it devastated the small island communities of Nauru and Banaba. Don't know if I'm saying this right. And in doing so, there was it polluted the entire land and water resources there. And so it was polluted with uranium and lead. And on top of that, this mine extraction, it led to the relocation of a lot of locals and resulted in their dependence on importation of food to maintain their livelihood rather than being independent and making use of their own or having autonomy over their own resources. And so this kind of pushed the Indigenous people farther away from their connection to the land, and also traditional practices such as fishing. And this resulted in a food insecurity. And on top of that, so food production in Hawaii right now, around 87% of the foods are now imported, grown, or in the island where food production occurs all year round, there's around 87% of it is now being imported. And so these local communities don't have autonomy over the own food that's grown there, and they often they don't have that sense of independence in the resources in their own land. And this can be seen in the kinds of foods that are imported. So they're canned meat, white rice. These foods are often high in sugar and low in nutrients. And so this also looks into the physical and mental health in these communities. And on top of that, it also severes relationships with coastal lands. And these coastal lands are traditional spaces for ancestral burial grounds and for cultivation of salt. And so severing these relationships with these lands, it kind of threatens their connection to their ancestors and also looks into the negative impact that it had on their spiritual, mental, and physical health. And because these local populations aren't able to go and fish or farm, their physical health is being impacted. And so this can be seen in the fact that Pacific Islands have the highest rates of diabetes globally. And so you can't separate imperialism and colonialism from these physical health outcomes. Next slide. And so just to conclude this paper, it just looks at the different ways imperialism and capitalism impacted these communities and how they had their own relationship to the environment that was severed. And so these lands are now seen as commodities and are just used for profit without regard for those who live there and who actually need the resources. And so like a lot of different Indigenous communities around the world, these islanders have a deep connection to their lands, and so they use a lot of traditional ecological knowledge to maintain their own well-being as well as the land's well-being. And so this paper just talks about how environmental justice programs should move past the judicial and procedural justice programs and look more into traditional ecological knowledge that these communities can offer to start looking into different programs and frameworks to start looking at different programs and frameworks to start. Oh, I forgot what I was going to say. Basically, they just talk about how these programs need to move past these judicial and procedural justice programs. And it also talks about how you need to focus on the physical, spiritual, genealogical, and sociopolitical relationships. And in doing so, they have noticed that these Pacific Islanders have been trying to reverse the effects of imperialism and colonization in their environmental justice programs. And in doing so, they've been trying to restore their traditional foodways to restore their biodiversity and their own relationship that they first had with these lands. And just to conclude, these islands they hardly have any carbon footprint, but they are the first to see these effects. And so this article just talks about how um, by using traditional ecological knowledge, it kind of reflects the relationships that humans have with their environment and how it's seen as inseparable. And so by creating a framework around kinship and providing reparations, such as returning land and resources, they will be better able to help these communities and these regions reverse the effects of colonialism. The end. So yeah, this paper was a very interesting and a very easy read.